rather provocative title. I was asked by Maria to be as controversial as possible in my presentation, so I might be fighting my way out of here at the end. Bit of background on me. So Cambridge Econometrics is a consultancy based in the UK. It applies modelling techniques to look at the economic impacts of climate policy and a whole lot of other things as well. But I'm very much coming at this from a policy-focused background. So I hope that this will come through in the slides that we show. Now, I'm only going to be here for one day, unfortunately. I'm heading to the COP tomorrow. And a few of the messages that I want to be taking to the COP come from our modelling results. So decarbonisation is, from 2018, the growth story of the 21st century. This is results from the Cambridge Econometrics E3ME global macroeconomic model, showing potential benefits to the economy of $26 trillion, that's quite a big number, by 2030, with a whole load of other stuff as well you can see on the slide. People living longer due to reduced air pollution, higher jobs and higher revenues for government. Basically, the story was, if we want to keep on growing our economies, this is the opportunity to do so, looking at low carbon development in a 2-degree scenario, $26 trillion. Decarbonisation is benefiting the EU economy. Again, this is from the end of last year, a tweet from Commissioner Cañete, looking at the EU's long-term strategy for decarbonisation. This is moving to 1.5 degrees. Cañete says, climate-neutral EU will increase Europe's GDP by 2% by 2050, mainly due to reducing fossil fuel imports. Again, results from the Cambridge Econometrics global E3ME macroeconomic model. And decarbonisation is good for society in general. I think you can see that up there. This is from IRENA, a global 2-degree scenario with a focus on renewable power. GDP up 1.1%, 24 million jobs, welfare up 3%, new trade opportunities, all very positive stuff. Again, using Cambridge Econometrics model. Message I won't be taking is this. Now, some of you may be familiar with this. This is from IPCC's 5th assessment report, showing the impacts on GDP of a 2-degree scenario. Now, again, everything is positive, but if you look at the axis title, here we're talking about losses rather than benefits. Results not from Cambridge Econometrics global model. So, title of the presentation probably gives away where this is going, but what I want to talk about in the time available, I think the first question, what is going on, is pretty critical here. Economists always disagree, as the saying goes. If you put 2 economists in the room, you will get at least 2 opinions, unless one of them is John Maynard Keynes, in which case you'll get a minimum of 3. Yeah. We can see that very clearly in the modelling results. I'll try to explain how these differences come about. What does it mean for policymakers? I mean, I can understand if you're a policy person and you see these results, not just different numbers, but different directions of impact. What do you do about that? And then finally, what can we, as researchers, do about it to both help communications and ultimately ensure that we come up with sensible policy as a result? So, at this point, I'd like to introduce you to 2 of my friends. We have the robot at the top, coming from a computer-based background. He is somebody that likes to optimize things. He's got a very capable head that is good at doing that. Lower down, I have a very nice young lady. She is trying to be, well, here what we're taking is a human being and we're giving the image as close to a human being as we can, and that picture represents that. Took these 2 pictures from the clip art package I used. I just typed in model into it to see what would come up, both of these things came up. Conclusion from that is different models for different purposes. It couldn't be much clearer than that. The word model means different things to different people. Different types of models are used for different things by different people. So as we go through the next few slides, everything that has the robot on it is an optimization a modeling approach. Everything that has the lady is a simulation approach. Now, what I want to get across is these two approaches. They're very different modeling approaches. They have completely different theoretical backgrounds, but they're used for different purposes. I'm not going to say one is right and one is wrong. I'm going to say that each one has its own particular use. So, optimization tools, as it says on the slide, to find the most efficient way to get to a fixed endpoint. So the example of a 2-degree scenario. You have your model, you run a baseline solution, you want to find how to get to a 2-degree solution, so you put in that constraint on emissions and you let the model work out the best way to get there. Simulation tools, entirely different, much more similar to what the climate modelers would recognise as a system. You run the model, you let it run to its endpoint. That's your baseline case. You put a shock in system, which could be a policy, it could be something else like a change in oil prices, something like that. You put that shock in, the model comes up with a different result, and the difference between those two runs tells you the impact of the shock that you're looking at. So two quite distinct traditions and methodologies here. Now, bringing human behaviour into this is where things start to get difficult. In the optimization approach, there's this fundamental assumption, the first one there, that people behave rationally, which is economics speak for in an optimal manner. That's basically the fundamental assumption to the approach, because if people don't behave in an optimal manner, you won't get optimized outcomes and the approach doesn't work. To do that, you have to make some further assumptions, which are listed on the slide. You must have perfect knowledge. Again, that's economic language for basically have to know all the options that are out there and what the impacts of choosing those options would be. All-seeing and all-knowing. Because again, if you don't know all the options, you can't choose the best one for you. Sometimes that includes knowing about the future, which is a bit spooky. But that if you want to optimize over a time period, you have to know exactly what will happen in that time period. And the usual assumption that markets must also work perfectly, so perfect competition to economists, meaning that prices are able to adjust, marginal costs equals marginal revenues, etc. And the prices adjust to give you a sort of equilibrium type outcome that solves for the system as a whole. Now, in the simulation approach, actually flip it slightly, it's a sort of contrapositive relationship. The fundamental assumption is people do not have perfect knowledge. There is uncertainty in the system, which leads to both risks and uncertainty. And because of that, people are not able to behave rationally, because there are things they don't know about. They cannot always pick the best option. So we have a completely different model of behaviour here. We have to look for other assumptions. And typically, the way the models work is they try to estimate behaviour from historical data. This is where the econometrics comes into the analysis, and that gets projected forwards. So two very different approaches. Now, just delving a bit deeper, the optimization world, and I'm slowly moving this across to a message to policymakers. So all available resources are used. Now this sort of falls out from the assumptions on the previous slides. We have, economists talk about factors of production, so land, labour, capital. There's a certain amount of each one. And because you optimize the system, what the model does is it finds the best way to use those resources to produce the highest level of production. Really, what this slide is saying is sort of how that happens. So, example, if there's an unemployed worker, unemployment, of course, exists in the real world. We can see it in the data. But in an optimal system, wage rates will automatically adjust. So if there's an unemployment, the wage rates will get pushed down until it becomes economically viable for a company to employ that person. Then they can work, produce, and you get the optimal level of production coming out from that. The key point is the 1, 2, 3, fourth one on there, the underlined one. Anything that prevents the optimal use of resources will lead to a reduction in output. Now that's just a fairly logical statement. The model is trying to produce the optimal outcome. If you do something that stops that, you can only make things worse overall. Now what that means for climate policy, and just thinking back to the IPCC slide, the way the models work, you run your baseline case and it optimizes, and then you put in the 2-degree scenario, and that's a whole load of constraints. And you effectively go from an optimization to a constrained optimization, and things get worse overall. And that's essentially what happened in that slide, what all the models did. The last point, the focus on price-based policies, it's not always the case, but generally because prices are really core to these models because they effectively determine how the optimization takes place. So what the models tend to focus on is policies that adjust those prices. And that usually means carbon taxes, emission trading systems. Not always, but usually. Now flipping the coin to the other side, the simulation world, how we get the impacts that we do, particularly from Cambridge Econometrics modelling. So working from the top, real-world behaviour is not optimal. People do not have perfect knowledge. That was on the slide 2 previously. On top of that, prices do not automatically adjust. Well, that's a separate assumption. Again, we look at the historical data to see whether that's the case or not. Typically, it's not. There may be lagged effects. It takes time for things to happen. And stocks matter as well as flows. Now, stocks are quite difficult to get into an optimization framework because it becomes very difficult to solve from a practical sense. But for simulation modeling, it's a lot easier to bring this in. Etienne in the previous presentation mentioned stock flow consistent modeling from a more Keynesian background. Well, this is what we're talking about here as one of the options. Now, if behavior is not optimal and prices don't adjust, we don't have this situation where the unemployed worker automatically finds a job because wage rates adjust. So it's not guaranteed all resources are used, and that means there may be spare capacity in the system. And again, this comes back, unemployment is the best example. There are unemployed workers. That is an indication of spare capacity. You could produce more than you were doing already. And what that means is, as the underlying point says, there is the possibility for policy to be implemented that draws on that capacity and increases output. And that's where you get the positive results from. And all the stories from Cambridge Econometrics modelling that I showed in the first 3 slides are all doing that. They're bringing unused resources into the system. And mainly the reason they're doing that is because we're looking at climate scenarios that require a lot of investment, and that investment is labour intensive and creates jobs, which leads to additional spending and multiplier effects, boosting both output and employment. The last point about the wide range of policies, because we have a pretty flexible framework here, we can put in quite a lot of different policies, not just price-based instruments, of course they are there as well, but regulatory policies have a much bigger effect in this type of modelling framework. I wanted to say one slide on technology. I wanted to say something on finance as well, actually, but that's all of tomorrow, so I'm going to leave that to for the presentations then. But it's a similar story for finance as for the real economy, employment and GDP. But technology. I say that the low carbon transition is a story of technology. We won't do it using the same technologies that we have right now in the same shares. The behavioural change would have to be enormous to do that. What we're aiming for is partly developing new technologies, but mostly getting the technologies that have been developed out there into the market and taken up. My colleague, Jean-François, who's sitting there, is the expert in this. I'm basically saying, hopefully not saying what he's going to say in his presentation. But the key is, how does technology fit into the economic model for this presentation? And looking at two approaches, optimization models are not well placed to assess either development or uptake of new technologies. Well, I was reading Mariana Mazzucato last week. She said a generation ago, technology was considered to be independent of the economy. So it was exogenous, outside the system. Scientists did their thing, they developed new technology. The economy did its own thing, separate to that. And the technology fed into the economy, but it was a one-way relationship. A generation ago, that may have been true. Sadly to say, there are still plenty of models out there that follow this approach. And it's really been, everything that's happened with solar has disproven it once and for all. What happened with solar is Germany went very big on solar, partly because of the nuclear shutdown. They wanted to replace that, but put in place policies to promote the uptake of solar power. What happened? Production started to increase, firms saw opportunities, there were economies of scale, costs came down, which of course led to higher demand. Other countries started to benefit from lower prices as well. Of course, a big impact when China got involved. Prices came down, and now the whole world benefits from cheaper solar. The policies in the economy fed into the development of technology. Absolutely crucial. Now, why do optimization models struggle with this? Partly it's just from a technical perspective. As soon as you allow the technologies to change, it becomes a lot more difficult to solve the models. But more importantly, on rates of uptake, in an optimization framework, it tends to be either one or the other. As soon as solar gets a little bit cheaper than the current cheapest technology, everything flips, because otherwise you're not going with the cheapest technology and you're not optimizing. Now, in the real world, we don't see these sudden jumps from one day to another. It takes time for these things to happen. So it fits a little bit awkwardly into the optimizing framework. From a simulation-based approach, again, we have more flexibility and the options for following paths of diffusion, which is basically Jean-François' work, which he's a leading expert in. We can fit that into a simulation approach much better. So again, we see a higher degree of realism in the results. Okay, I only have 3 more slides, so I will fit in the time. Hopefully I've been convincing you that there are a lot of benefits to a simulation-based approach, which which Etienne presented was a simulation-based approach. I think what Matt will present will be as well. Otherwise, I have a very poor understanding of the work that you do. But the question I often get is, so why, we saw that IPCC chart, why are all the models using this optimization approach? And it seems to be often using it and not for the right application. And sadly, this does bring us back to core mainstream economics. So neoclassical economics. So it blurs a distinction because all of those assumptions that are presented, they say, well, actually that is how it works in the real world. It doesn't really seem to matter how much they get disproved. It still carries on. Second point, people from engineering and operations research background. This is not particularly a dig at people from these backgrounds. Human behavior doesn't feature in these areas so much. And then they come and work with economists that say, well, actually, you don't need to bother about behaviour. It's perfectly understandable that they keep on using the same methods as well. The next 2 points are more practical. The modelling approach is well established. There are lots of tools that do that. There's a critical mass, path dependency in this. People keep on doing what has been done in the past. There are lots of utilities and resources out there to help you do it. One slide, as I was asked to be controversial. I don't know if there are any members of the EAERE, that's European Association of Energy and Resource Economists, if I remember right. The largest group of environmental economists in the EU. They put out a statement saying, we need to have a carbon price. Carbon price is the most efficient way of meeting carbon reduction targets. Once we have a carbon price, we can start to get rid of all the other policies which are less efficient. Now, in a previous slide, I mentioned perfect competition and perfect markets. If you assume you have perfect markets, then a market-based policy is going to be the perfect outcome. All you are doing is restating your assumptions. So I found that a rather false conclusion. I put out, this is a blog post from the Cambridge Econometrics website, saying basically that this is rather misguided. You're just restating your own assumptions. Using the example of European policy on the right-hand side of the slide shows why in the real world we don't just go purely for carbon pricing options. I have sat in a room with European policymakers where economists have tried to make this case. But in the EU we have more of a portfolio of policies. We have energy efficiency targets because we know that there are lots of energy efficiency options that are cost effective, but people still don't do it because either they don't know about it, they don't have access to capital, etc. Carbon price will not help that, so you need regulation. And we have targets for renewables to help develop the technologies so that the costs come down and they're available for later on when really we need to get to net zero and we need cheap renewables to do that. So we have this portfolio of policies, and it's because the policies have been taken from the real world requirements, not what sits inside the models. Okay, more positively, always try to finish on a positive note. Conclusions and the way forwards. I do want to stress this is not about getting positive or negative answers about why the climate policy is good for the economy or not. Sometimes we get people from NGOs that, of course, they want to get a particular result. But for me, this is much more about using the right tool for the right job and not relying on assumptions. So to finish, I put these 3 questions for all of you guys whenever you see modelling results. I wanted to have 4, but I took out the one about finance because that's for tomorrow. But yeah, 3 questions. First one about perfect knowledge and rational behaviour. I think if you ask that question, you will know what kind of model you're dealing with at the end of it. And a very simple and practical question, is there unemployment in the model? And by that I mean involuntary unemployment, so not just people that are between jobs, but people that want to have a job but can't get one. And the last one about technology, can't really stress this enough, because if we don't talk about technology, we're really sort of missing 95% of the question here. And if it's not there properly in the model, then I wouldn't put much faith in the results overall. So it's quite a quick run through, but I hope these questions can be taken away and used for future research. Thank you very much.
That was great, Hector. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. I'll start with Michael because I can get to him.
Very nice. Thank you very much. There are 2 other questions. Did you just use GDP as opposed to using a lot of other things that we know describe the picture? And any way that you can work GPI in? The idea that you want to optimize real progress. You know, I managed to use an acronym that...
Yes, you got me. Yeah. Yes, I was
Touche.
just thinking that. Yes. Yeah. So the
progress index or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So the focus on GDP. This is partly because in the optimization world, GDP is what you're trying to optimize. So they always focus on that, and partly this is to basically go into cost-benefit analyses. So certain governments can do their calculations. Now, from the modelling that we do, there's a whole range of indicators that come out. Now, we do often focus on GDP because that's what the policy people ask for. But in fact, usually when I work for European Commission, it's how many jobs. That's what they're most interested in. It's what's the impact on employment, and that's what they go with as the headline indicator. So there are other options as well in there. Now, in terms of the general progress indicator or some measure of welfare, the IRENA results I showed at the beginning, they did have a measure of welfare. It is a bit arbitrary, and we have long discussions about what indicators we put into that and how we add them together and what weightings goes on to everything. If we could come to an agreement on that, then that would be fantastic. Because I completely agree, GDP is sometimes a very misleading outcome, but it is what people understand. So for communication purposes, it does tend to be.
There's a reason for the polarization.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
Absolutely.
More questions? Great, over here.
From your talk, I mean, you are saying that simulation, if you use simulation, it's easier to describe progress in technology, but you don't provide any more than just this this predicate. I mean, how come simulation make it easier to model technologies change?
Yeah, I think this, I said on the slide, although I didn't talk about it, but modelling technology is still very difficult. We're always going to run up against the problem that we don't know about future technologies. So it's, if we knew about future technologies, we probably wouldn't need to do the modelling in the first place. And that applies to any modelling approach. What I would say for a simulation-based modelling approach, we're trying to mimic the behaviour of the take-up of new technologies. But when we look at the development of new technologies, I think that's a completely different matter. But we can draw upon previous transitions between technologies. Jean-Francois has some great slides showing previous transitions, say from horses to cars, and sort of the S-shaped path that you get in that transition. So these can get integrated into the modelling framework and showing the decisions between switching between certain technologies and the paths that you take. Path dependency is absolutely critical here. Once technologies become established, they do tend to stick around. And the lifetimes of technologies is important because these can be quite slow-moving things. I think just because a simulation-based approach has a lot more flexibility, we can try to fit these things into it. Certainly, by no means perfect. We've never claimed that. But with the right parameterization, there are options to do that. Whereas from an optimization framework, it's much more rigid because as soon as costs change, you start to get flips and very sudden changes, simply because that is how the approach works.
We've got one more question up the back.
Okay.
Quick
Yeah,
one, hopefully.
There's a couple. First, to make a couple points. One is rationality in economics. I think you're using an incredibly narrow way. It's not that you're equating with perfect knowledge. There's been decades of research done on decision theory under uncertainty that defines rationality much differently than this in a much more flexible way that accommodates much richer type of decision theoretic environment. So I'd be a little bit cautious about that critique. Endogeneity of technology is something which economists have wrestled with for decades now, and certainly is an important subject, I would agree. But now as a person who likes to use both optimization and simulation methods, I was a little bit curious in the sense of, you talk about simulation methods, but you never told us what you simulated. And part of the key thing of critiquing research is to open up the black box, and so I can actually see what goes on. And if I just say, well, here's a simulation and I can address all these problems, it kind of makes it hard for the audience to assess where the successes are. And so I hope there's like documents or stuff we can read where we actually see what you're simulating.
Yeah, a very fair point. I completely agree. If I'd been given a slot for 2 hours, and I would have given you. But yeah, certainly for our modelling, transparency is critical. If you want people to have faith in the results, they need to understand what you're doing. Completely agree. We put all the manuals and documentation online on our website and make parameters available as well. What we're simulating is the economic system linked to the energy system and emissions from that, and trying to reduce it to a reasonably small number of equations, but that's still probably in 6 figures. But yeah, I completely agree with your points there.
Let's thank Hector again.
Thank you.